Japan built something in 1994 that most of the world never heard of. Not because it failed, not because it was forgotten, but because the people who drove it, the ones who actually knew what it could do, quietly kept it to themselves. America had the Corvette, Germany had the 911, Italy had the Ferrari, and Japan had the Z32, a car that could humiliate all three of them on a mountain road, and nobody in the West seemed to notice. A design studio in Atsugi, Japan, 1983, a team of engineers is handed an impossible brief. Build a car that is faster, more sophisticated, and emotionally compelling than anything Japan has ever made. Give it twin turbos, give it a shape that makes people stop walking, and do it on a budget that would make a Ferrari executive laugh. They didn't laugh for long. In its first full year of sale, the Z32 twin-turbo pulled 0 to 60 in 5.0 seconds flat, making it faster than the Porsche 911 Carrera of the same year, at less than half the price. Hey, this is Mark, and you're welcome to AUTOSAYS. If that number already surprised you, stay with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story ends up, because it gets significantly stranger before it makes sense. The Nissan Fairlady Z has always had a split personality. In Japan, it was called the Fairlady, a name borrowed from a Broadway musical that Nissan's founder had apparently seen and loved during a trip to New York. In America, it was just the Z, clean, aggressive, no poetry attached. And that split, the elegant Japanese name versus the blunt American identity, turned out to be a preview of something much larger, because the Z32 was built for two audiences simultaneously, and it succeeded at being something entirely different for each of them. To understand why the Z32 existed at all, you have to go back to 1984, when Nissan was watching its sports car legacy collapse in slow motion. The S130 and Z31 models had drifted. They'd gotten softer, heavier, more comfort-oriented. Sales were falling. The enthusiast community was drifting toward imports from Europe and the newly aggressive Mazda RX-7. Nissan's internal research team flagged something alarming. The brand that had once defined Japanese performance was in danger of being remembered as the brand that used to define it. That's a very different thing, and the people at the top of Nissan knew it. The response was a clean sheet redesign, not a refresh, not an evolution, a complete restart, and a mandate to produce a car that would recapture the Z's position at the summit of Japanese performance engineering. The team that built it, led by designer Toshio Yamashita and chief engineer Yoshimi Nishio, spent years on aerodynamics alone. The Z32's drag coefficient came in at 0.31, a number that in 1989 was genuinely remarkable for a sports car with that kind of visual drama. Most cars that looked this aggressive had the aerodynamics of a barn door. The Z32 managed to be beautiful and slippery at the same time. But here's where it gets strange. Despite everything Nissan built into this car, despite the aluminum hood, the four-wheel steering, the independent multi-link suspension at all four corners, the hand-assembled 3-liter twin-turbocharged V6 pushing 300 horsepower, the Z32 was almost never properly tested against its European rivals in the Western press. Road and Track ran it, Car and Driver gave it space, but the kind of sustained, obsessive attention that was handed to every new Porsche or Ferrari, it never arrived. The car existed in a strange middle place, admired by people who drove it, largely invisible to everyone else. And that invisibility had a financial consequence that nobody at Nissan had planned for. The Z32 was priced at around $32,000 at launch in the United States, a number that in $1990 put it in genuine competition with entry-level European sports cars. But the buyers who typically spent $32,000 on a sports car in 1990 were buyers who wanted a European badge. They wanted Stuttgart or Maranello. They weren't thinking about Yokohama. The prestige math simply didn't work in Nissan's favor, so the Z32 sold, but it never sold the way it should have, and Nissan, watching the numbers, began to lose confidence in the segment entirely. That lack of confidence, that boardroom hesitation, would eventually kill the Z line for a decade, but we'll get to that. What the sales figures couldn't capture was what was happening at the track. The twin-turbo VG30DETT engine in the Z32 was not just fast, it was engineered with a kind of obsessive precision that was unusual even by Japanese standards. Sequential twin turbos, a small one for immediate response at low revs, a larger one that came online as the engine climbed higher, meant the power delivery was smooth in a way that contemporary turbocharged engines rarely were. The dreaded turbo lag that plagued European rivals was essentially eliminated. You pressed the throttle and the car moved, not after a pause, not with a sudden violent kick, it just moved, with authority, in a straight line, and with enough grip to make the authority feel controlled. Four-wheel steering was another feature that the mainstream press occasionally mentioned and never really explained. The rear wheels of the Z32 turned fractionally, in the same direction as the fronts at higher speeds for stability, in the opposite direction at lower speeds for agility. It was a system that made a 90-kilogram heavier car feel lighter on a mountain road than physics should have allowed. The engineers called it super hikis. Drivers who experienced it called it unsettling the first time, addictive the second, and something they never wanted to drive without after that. Now, you'd think a car this accomplished would have generated decades of devoted enthusiasm from the automotive press. You'd think Nissan would have been showered with accolades, that Z32 wins at Nürburgring would have been front-page news, and the car would have been culturally embedded as the 911 or the RX-7. None of that happened. And the reason goes back to something that still shapes the automotive industry today. The story that gets told isn't always the story of the best car. It's the story of the car with the best publicist. Porsche in the early 1990s was a masterclass in automotive mythology management. Ferrari had an entire cultural apparatus built over decades. Nissan had excellent engineers and a marketing department that, when faced with explaining sequential twin-turbo technology to an American audience, apparently decided that was a lot to ask. The Z32 got competent advertising. What it needed was a legend. There's a difference. The car's domestic reception in Japan was a different story entirely. The Fairlady Z quickly developed a following among the toge community, the mountain pass drivers who treated Japanese roads the way American hot rodders treated the quarter mile. In those circles, the Z32 wasn't undersold, it was celebrated, obsessively modified, and driven in ways that European manufacturers never anticipated their cars being driven. The aftermarket parts industry that grew around the Z32 in Japan was enormous. Companies like Mines, Greddy, and HKS built entire business models around extracting more from the VG30DETT engine. Tuned examples producing 450, 500, even 600 horsepower became relatively common. The platform turned out to be astonishingly robust, built with tolerances that could handle power levels nobody at Nissan officially sanctioned. And that robustness had an economic life of its own. A well-maintained Z32 twin-turbo today, not a modified one, just a stock, clean, original example, commands prices that would have seemed impossible in 1994. In 2015, clean Z32s were moving for $8,000 to $12,000 for genuinely excellent examples. Modified, documented, single-owner cars from Japan have cleared $70,000 at auction. A car that was once invisible to investors is now being chased by them, which raises an obvious question that nobody at the time thought to ask. What else did the market miss? The Z32's production run ended in 2000, not with a bang. Quietly, efficiently, in the way that things end in Japan, without drama, without a farewell tour. Nissan had already been through its financial crisis. Carlos Ghosn had arrived, the Renault-Nissan alliance had reorganized priorities. The Z, as a halo product for a company fighting for survival, was a luxury that the new balance sheet couldn't justify. The line went dark. For 2 years, there was no Z at all, a gap that felt like a silence where something important used to be.
The Z returned in 2002 as the Z33, a car that was good, commercially successful, and beloved in its own right. But the engineers who had worked on the Z32 knew something the market would only discover later. What they had built in 1989 was not a transitional car. It was a finished idea, a car that had figured something out. And the decade that followed, the decade of the Z32's absence, gave the enthusiast world enough time and enough distance to realize that what they'd been taking for granted was actually quietly exceptional. There's a version of this story where the Z32 gets the attention it deserved in 1990, where Road and Track gives it a cover, where Nissan's marketing department finds the language to explain what sequential turbos feel like on a mountain pass, where the Western enthusiast community tracks it the way they tracked every development from Stuttgart. That version of the story doesn't produce a cult car. It produces a famous car. And famous cars don't have the same afterlife. They don't have the same slow burn of discovery, the same community that forms around a secret, the same quiet pride of ownership that comes from knowing something the rest of the world missed. The 1994 Nissan Fairlady Z twin-turbo didn't need to be a secret to be great, but being a secret may be exactly why it endures. The question worth sitting with, especially if you're someone who follows what the market does to undervalued cars, is what the Z32 tells us about how we assign value to machines in real time. Because the people who ignored it in 1994 and the people paying $60,000 for one today are often the same type of person. They just have 30 years of hindsight between them. Drop a comment below. If you had to choose one Japanese sports car from the 1990s that deserved far more global recognition than it received, not the Supra, not the NSX, something that slipped through the cracks, what would it be? And if you want to find out why Nissan nearly abandoned performance cars entirely after 2000 and how one meeting in Paris changed everything, that's the next video. Don't miss it.